It's really nice to meet you. Was asked to talk a little bit about the relationship between Brazilian society and football, and I wondered, did you guys watch the World Cup? Everybody watched a bit of the World Cup. Did you watch Germany 7, Brazil 1? The peak moment, really, actually, of the tournament. Certainly the moment I was most energised. In fact, I was on the ceiling, banging my fist with pleasure during that. It was something close to ecstasy. What did it mean? Did it mean anything? You know, at that moment, at that tiny little moment, you know, of course one was just caught by the commercial spectacular, by the athletic brilliance, by the narrative kind of excitement. But do these things linger in some sense? Do they carry on meaning something? And that's really what I wanted to talk about today, was just to try and decode a little bit of what actually Germany 7, Brazil 1 was about, and how it looks now 3-4 months later that the dust has settled. And to understand any given game of football, you have to understand it in a context, almost a canon of other great games, great moments, okay, against which it should be adjudged. I mean, those of you who are familiar with T.S. Eliot's critical writing on the English literary canon and on poetry in particular, that's exactly how he argues it. He says, all poems speak to each other. To understand the wasteland, you've got to have read some Milton, because the two are always in intertextual dialogue with each other, and thus the richness of the canon emerges from those conversations. That idea of intertextuality seems to me to have been taken up by Latin American and Brazilian, Argentinian in particular, football writers in the 1920s, before anybody else has gone into this in the world of football. So in that spirit, I want to tell you the story of a few other games that Brazil have played over the years to put 7-1 in perspective, and in so doing understand something about the changing relationship between soccer and Brazilian society and culture. So the first game I wanted to tell you about took place in 1902. And it took place in Rio. It was the first game played for a proto-Brazilian championship. I mean, it was called the Brazilian Championship at the time, and it was between a team from Sao Paulo and a team from Rio. And at this point, football is actually only in some official or recorded capacity been in Brazil for about 8 years properly. What we do know is that in 1894-95, Charles Miller, the son of a Scottish coffee planter and a Brazilian woman, returns home from England, where he's had his public school education, and apocryphally he returns with 2 leather footballs and a copy of the Football Association rulebook. And about a month later, with other Englishmen who populate the elite athletic clubs of Sao Paulo of the 1890s, they go to a field and have to clear the goats off the field. And the first game is played between a team from the gasworks and the electrical company, which kind of gives you a sense of where football is located, because unglamorous as the gas company may sound, that is the leading edge of modern technology in Sao Paulo in the 1890s. These are Britons who understand electricity and are installing the city's first electric lights. And this is part of the cachet of football. Hard as it is to imagine in the 21st century, when Britain is a funny little island sinking slowly into the North Sea beneath slate-grey skies and fog. In the 1890s, it's the coolest thing on the whole planet. You know, modernity is coming from Britain for these folks in 1890, and football has that cachet. So by 1902, football has spread like wildfire amongst the tiny elites of these cities, first Sao Paulo and then Rio. First expatriates, particularly from Britain, but then Americans, Germans, and very quickly members of the Brazilian elite. And of course there are many personal and familial and social connections. And it's almost a kind of cultic practice at this point. And they play in 1902, and the moment, Sao Paulo beat Rio. But the moment that strikes me, it tells us something so interesting about Brazilian football, is that in the celebrations they toast and then they bathe the ball in champagne, and this is how the game is reported. And it just seems to me, from its very inception, Brazilian football, or Brazil's understanding of football, has a sense of flamboyance, of bling, of just out there-ness, you know, in a way. Nobody in England in the 1890s is pouring champagne on a football. That is definitely not considered appropriate behaviour. But in Brazil, that is making sense, and it tells you the sort of, you know, playboy, hedonistic, masculine world in which football is being played and invented in Brazil. So that's 1902. Let's jump forward to 1917 and imagine ourselves at Fluminense, which is the elite club of elite clubs, an entire sports club of which football is one section, based in Laranjeiras, in one of the nicest bits of the Zona Azul in Rio. And they're about to win the Tricampeonato, which is already, Brazil by this point has already invented a whole series of vocabulary that has displaced the English with which football originally arrived. And we have slang, we have titles, we have turns of phrase already in Brazilian Portuguese, and the English has been lost. And let's imagine what we would see, what it would look like if we were standing in the crowd. Well, the first thing you'd note, you know, as the players walked out, is that this still is for the most part, is the elite of elites. You know, the people playing for Fluminense are future governors of the Bank of Brazil, future professors, future, you know, writers. They're absolutely the very peak of the Rio elite. Though around the edges you might notice a few people from slightly lower social class who are beginning to appear, who are definitely amongst the better players on the team, but they're around the edges, and they're still all white. But and as they come out, there would have been an extraordinary English-style cheer, and this is still the English connection of hip hip hurrah. Quite how that sounds with a Brazilian Portuguese accent, I don't know. I don't know if I'm up to that impression, but hip hip hurrah. And the gentlemen are wearing blazers, and in the style of the English public schools they have boaters and perhaps a discreet kind of handkerchief or band on the hat that indicates the colours of your team, which is exactly how the public schools of England operate. According to your house, they will have colours. And you would have also noticed that at least 20% of the audience were women, possibly more than that in the fancy parts of the stadium. I mean, quite contrary to the experience of most early football cultures, which are overwhelmingly masculine and remain overwhelmingly masculine at this point, and you see it in much of the kind of literature, in the chronicles of the era. The great Lima Barreto, one of the kind of great writers of early 20th century Brazil, dwells on it regularly in his columns, and it indicates that this is a social occasion. Right? This is a social occasion of for social mixing, for partying, for courting. Indeed, there is a whole kind of sexual frisson about the way in which football is played and experienced. And it's notable, you know, at half-time, players would often wander up into the stands and have a chat with the woman who caught their eye on the wing during the game. It's standard form. They would have a drink together, and of course they would be followed by sumptuous balls. Fluminense, as well as having the earliest and most modern football stadium in Brazil, had a ballroom for 500 people. I've walked into it. I mean, it's just absolutely unbelievable. You know, it's like walking into Yankee Stadium and finding, you know, a ballroom with, you know, decorated like the Palace of Versailles with gigantic chandeliers. And one of the things you notice is how players are depicted, and they're often depicted in this era, you see it in Botafogo, as kind of semi-divine Hellenic gods, is the view of the football player. And indeed some of the finest erotic poetry in Brazil in the early 20th century is written of football players cast in that mode. So what on earth is going on there? What does football come to mean in this context? And at Fluminense you would have been lucky enough to see Enrico Coelho Neto, who is a poet, a writer, a columnist, the kind of all-round intellectual figure of the era, who is completely obsessed with Fluminense. He claimed to have gone to see Fluminense often 5 times on one day, because all of his kids played in the youth teams and then he'd stay behind for the main match at the end of the day. and he is credited with leading the first pitch invasion in Brazilian football history in 1915, challenging a referee's decision. He led the sort of gentleman of the stands out onto the pitch, and he wrote the first recorded hymn, as they call it in Brazil, because all teams have their official hymn. Interesting, in other football cultures we have songs, but in Brazil we have hymns. Even completely secular tunes are considered to be hymns. And the words of this, which is, do you know the song It's a Long Way to Tipperary? You may not, that may be off. It's a World War I marching song, so rather odd. And loosely translated, what this song was saying was, here we all are at Fluminense, a carnival of fresh air and good morals. Here we are playing football, right? How does he put it? Strengthening the white race, strengthening the nation of Brazil. I mean, and it's explicit as that. And at this point, you know, what is a Brazilian? What does Brazil actually mean? Well, for the tiny number of literate members of the white elite in Rio and Sao Paulo who are worrying about this, it's, well, we're Europeans. We're Europeans, we just happen to be in the tropics. And they can see by 1917 that, you know, the demographic reality of Brazil, this is going to be a difficult position to maintain. So if you absorb the eugenic racism of late 19th century Europe at the same time, what you end up with is a moral panic about the physicality and masculinity of your gene pool. And so Coelho Neto, alongside an awful lot of other people in those circles, are looking to football as a way of building the Brazilian white race, ensuring their genetic survival. It's the same sort of arguments you hear in Baden-Powell's accounts of scouting and its relationship to the British Empire. So I just love that, to the tune of the lot. I mean, I don't think anyone's actually done a eugenic racist chant since, but it's completely extraordinary that Coelho Neto did. So that's what football is meaning in 1917 in Brazil. Let's jump forward a bit to 1938, and the game that I would tell you about then is at the World Cup in France that year, and in the opening game Brazil played Poland, and they were 3-0 up in about 15 minutes, 4-0 up by half time. They let the lead slip, so it's 4-4 on 90 minutes, and then they win in extra time 5-4. Why is this an extraordinary moment? What does it tell us about Brazil? Well, the first thing to say is the stars of the team are African Brazilians, Afro-Brazilians, two black players, Leonardes the striker and Domingos de Guia the defender, unambiguously. Why is this so extraordinary? Well, back in 1917, all those teams are completely white, first and foremost. Secondly, on a number of occasions in the 1920s and as late as the 1930 World Cup, politicians intervened in the composition of the Brazilian team when going overseas, saying no black players, particularly when going to Argentina, where they would always be on the end of the most vociferous kind of racist comments, such as the nature of Argentina. But irrespective of that, there is a kind of, you know, amongst the elite there remains a deep shame about the ethnic makeup of Brazil, and they haven't got over the fact that we're not actually white Europeans, you know, that happen to be in the tropics. And this plays itself out in many, many ways in football between 1917 and 1938. And the most important aspect of that, a story that's pretty familiar, where, you know, the marginal and the ethnically excluded fight their way to some sort of acceptance and sort of social citizenship through participation in sport. And that's the story of the 1920s and the 1930s. Football becomes increasingly professional and popular, and once there's money and competition around, the possibility of, you know, if you're good, begins to make sense. And the decisive moment is Vasco da Gama, one of the teams of Rio, run rather than by the privileged elites of the coffee houses and the banks, but by recent immigrant sort of Portuguese business people who are a bit more rough and ready and a bit more, don't have the same airs and graces of the elite. And it's like, you know, they're working with these people all the time, no problem. You know, you want to play, you're good, you're in. And Vasco win the championship, and it's a big, long struggle. I won't go into the details. The elite clubs try and break away. When they break away, no one wants to go and see them because they're no good. So then they beg them to come back. Then they try and exclude the poor and black players by introducing all sorts of literacy requirements. Vasco says, no problem, we'll teach everybody to read. You know, we'll find them jobs, whatever. And eventually it becomes legalised. I mean, Brazil is very early amongst the nations of the world in becoming professional. In fact, I think Brazil's probably ahead of everybody except Austria, England and Scotland in the emergence of a kind of legally defined professionalism in commercial football. So that's, you know, you've got this extraordinary emergence of mulatto and Afro-Brazilian talent in domestic football. And finally, the world gets to see it in 1938. But not only does the world get to see it, and this is the other really interesting side of it, is the whole of Brazil listens to it. Because at last radio has arrived in Brazil. And the Vargas regime, as those of you who studied Brazil will know, invested enormous time and energy and money in promoting the radio industry, because here was a way, you know, the Brazilian nation, I mean, there's no network, there's no infrastructure that truly tracks Brazil until the radio arrives. I mean, if you think, even in, you know, the 1930s, Belgium had, you know, more railway than Brazil. So transport-wise, communications-wise, nothing is connecting it. And then the radio arrives. And so every last little town right out into the northeast, deep in the south, they've all got radios and they're listening to it live. And it was mayhem. It was absolute mayhem. And then they're flying movies back across the Atlantic, and people are beating on the doors of the cinemas in downtown Rio to see the games 3, 4, 5 days later. And Brazil then play the Czechs, and it's a really nasty, vicious game actually, with about 5 people sent off. And you know, the idea that Brazil is playing the beautiful game or has some kind of innate sinuous quality is definitely, you know, that's not the case in here. Now they get past the Czechs, and basically they end up coming third. They lose to the Italians, but the Italians are the world champions, so no disgrace there. And they come home, and it's like, it's clearly a national triumph. It's a national triumph, but what does it mean? And the person that crystallises it, however mythic the actual account, is Gilberto Frei, who you may know, those of you who studied Brazil, a leading intellectual and historian who argued that Brazil, instead of being embarrassed about its mixed heritage and its slave heritage, should actually see its Africanness as intrinsic to the quality of what made Brazil. And he said, you know, he described the triumph and the victory in 1938. He said, you know, that in contrast to the angular game played by the Europeans, you know, this is an expression of everything that's great about Brazil, about its sinuousness. This is what we have in dance, this is what we have in music, this is what we have in the demographic makeup of the country. So that, whatever the truth about race and racism in Brazil, at that moment you have the leading intellectual of the era saying, what makes us great is that, you know, we're mulatto. This is no longer something to be ashamed of. In fact, this defines us, it makes us completely brilliant. And at that moment, particularly when you think that Brazil remains incredibly illiterate, and the only other option in the cupboard is the white eugenics on the tropics model, suddenly football becomes, you know, in this protean moment of inventing what the Brazilian nation is, which is what the Vargas regime is more widely up to. Here is the gift. Here's actually something to pin it on. Here's something tangible. We're good at it. We're really good at it. The rest of the world thinks we're good at it, and it expresses our mulatto quality. This is a gift to this new conception of nationalism. And that's 1938. And this rises all the way through the 1940s, you know, while the rest of the world is living the firestorm of the Second World War. Brazil is in its kind of nice little protected zone. Football just booms, and it booms partly because it's taken on these meanings, you know, and partly because it's great. I mean, it's a whole complex array of things. And the peak moment is meant to be 1950. After the Second World War, Brazil hosts the first World Cup. They're the only people really who are in shape to do it. And it's on the back of 20 years of urbanisation, 20 years of development. You know, we've discovered that what expresses the greatness of the nation is Brazilian football. And now we are going to show the world. This is the coming out party. Wait and see. And they build, as part of that, the Maracanã, which you'll be familiar with, in its original beautiful form rather than its appalling, destroyed form that it now exists in. We'll come back to that later. But it is an extraordinary statement. I mean, very few societies that I can think of have really pinned, you know, even more than, you know, Brasilia is still to come, which is the architectural icon of Brazilian modernity. But the Maracanã, architecturally, you know, anticipates precisely, I would say, Brasilia in its form and its look, and its football, and it's 15 years earlier they've got to it. And it is, for my money, the most beautiful football stadium ever built. And in its original form, it actually expressed a much more generous and open conception of Brazilian nationalism and identity, I think, than Brasilia or the stadiums of the 2014 World Cup. It was always a public project. It always had public facilities as part of it. It was never just the Maracanã football stadium. There was a school built, which continues to be one of the best public schools in Rio. It was in a poor area of town, not in a rich area of town. It was built on the ruins of an old English colonial jockey club, which was an interesting statement. It had swimming facilities, gymnastic facilities. You know, it was, rather than hidden away on a ring road somewhere, it's bang in the middle of the city. So it was a really kind of, you know, when modernism had that kind of generous, democratic, open sort of quality to it, I think the Maracanã exemplified that, and it was incredibly beautiful at the same time. And to cut a long story short, Brazil get to the last game. Some of you will no doubt know this story, so I'll make it short. And the way it worked was they didn't actually have a final in those days. It was like a little round robin. And the way it's set up is it's Brazil versus Uruguay. It's the last game of the tournament. Brazil don't even need to win. All they got to do is draw, and the World Cup is theirs. So it's local elections in Rio that week, and the team's hotel and training ground, of course, flooded with politicians making speeches, wanting photographs. The whole country is in uproar, certainly Rio. Everybody expects them to win. The level of expectation you can imagine is just sort of off the scale. And on the day, I mean, the Maracanã was designed notionally to take around 175 to 180,000. And again, it's slightly apocryphal, but the pictures, I think, bear it out. Around 250,000 people go into the stadium, which is like, you know, a third of Rio's adult population at the time. I mean, that's like, okay, 250,000 people. And the mayor of Rio, in the greatest act of hubris, the greatest act of hubris ever, says to the team in front of 250,000 people, "You, who have already established yourself as the greatest team on this earth, you who are about to be champions," and it's like, really? So they go out, Brazil go 1-0 up in the first half. Everybody's, you know, party, party, party. They're singing Carmen Miranda's take on Bullfight in Madrid, which was like the unofficial theme tune of the tournament. And then in the second half, Uruguay scored 2 goals. And the game finishes 2-1. And while, you know, there has been a lot of over-egging of the pudding, as we say, and a lot of misremembered stuff, it is still just extraordinary to see the footage, the complete silence in the stadium. You see Jules Rimet, who was the president of FIFA at the time, walks onto the pitch at the end, and he's got, the old World Cup was this little world, Nike, basically, with the little wings, and it's in a little wooden box that's hinged, and you can see he's sort of got it under his arm. He's kind of like, who do I give it to? How do I get the hell out of here? And Obdulio Varela, who is the enormous captain of Uruguay, is next to him, and you see him, he literally just goes, "You take it!" and, you know, runs off the pitch. And Pelé, you know, in his memoirs describes, he said it was, you know, he was in a small town in Belo Horizonte. He said it was like a war, like Brazil had lost the war and everyone was dead. And Nelson Rodrigues, with his classic bad taste and overstatement, the Brazilian playwright and columnist, said, every country has its Hiroshima, 1950 was ours. And I think what is actually beyond the sort of hyperbole, what really tells you the really interesting moment is who got blamed afterwards, because there were always scapegoats. And the scapegoats, what do you know? The 3 black players on the team, including the goalkeeper Barbosa. Now, this is completely unjustified, and these people were hounded. And Barbosa was so hounded, you know, and lived and died in penury as a consequence, that in 1994 some sympathetic journalists tried to have him rehabilitated in the national memory by taking him to the team's training ground before the 1994 World Cup. They wouldn't let the man in. They would not let the man in. And I saw him on film tell a story, you know, like 30 years later he walks into a bar and or a bakery, I think, and this woman shielded her children from him and said, "This is the man who made all Brazil cry." Imagine walking around with that over your head. But it was, you know, this is about race. This is not about who let the goal in. You know, it was very clearly the happy, lovely, mixed mulatto Brazil of 1938 dissolves in this sort of acid bath of racist recrimination, and a whole kind of revival of all sorts of racist stereotypes about black players not being psychologically disciplined enough, not being tough enough. All this nonsense is completely reactivated at this moment of national disaster. 1958, that's when the thing is redeemed, and the Brazil that I think you all probably have a feel for, the Brazil of Pelé, of Garrincha, of the beautiful game, of winning the World Cup 3 times, of the best team ever, samba football, that is born in 1958. And in 1958, Brazil win the World Cup by beating Sweden 5-2 in the final in Stockholm. And it is the product, that team and that performance is a product of 20 years of genuine football development. I mean, it's a serious commercial culture. You know, Brazilians are taking it seriously and working it. It didn't come out of nowhere. And you've got these booming cities. They've really opened up the talent pool to people of every ethnicity and socio-economic group. There's money behind it. There's a degree of organisation. The fan culture is extraordinary in the 50s. I mean, they invent the use of the smoke bomb, the flare, the flags, the crazy confetti. This is all being spontaneously generated on the terraces in Brazil, and is a sight to behold. And it reflects a time, it's boom time in Brazil. This is the era of Kubitschek, of, you know, 50 years development in 5. They're going to build Brasilia at 7% growth, more than that. Brazil, this is, and it's a moment when it's a pretty golden moment for Brazil's working classes. Wages are rising, there really are jobs. People are moving to the city and changing their lives, and joining a football club and being part of that thing is one of the ways in which you assimilate into the new urban Brazil. So this is a golden moment for all the misremembering. And then it's topped by, they basically get organised. Then João Havelange, who is obviously the devil incarnate, the ex-head of FIFA, previously head of the Brazilian Football Federation, man, he could organise, and he really got things sorted out. I mean, for example, the Brazilian football team had never been to a dentist before. They'd never had a dentist. So one of the things he did, because toothache was always messing with people, is he had them all go to Brazil's top dental hospital, and they extracted 240 teeth from the squad, which is, so epidemiologically this is a team of the people, and about half the team had kind of gastric stuff that you just don't even want to know about. So they go and they win in style. They don't just go and win, they really do win in style. When you've got Pelé and Garrincha on the team, and I mean, just an extraordinary array of talent. And it's worth actually watching sometime if this takes your fancy, the final, because it's an extraordinary cosmopolitan moment. This is the moment in which the world falls in love with Brazil, not just Brazil falling in love with its own football team. This is the first time that it's televised in Europe live, and then is repeated and available in other places. And you can see the Swedish crowd are cheering the Brazilians at the end When the Brazilians score goals 4 and 5, the Swedes stand and applaud, which again is sort of another world. And then in this extraordinary kind of display of generosity afterwards, the Brazilians parade the World Cup but carry a gigantic Swedish flag with them. I mean, can you imagine Maradona in 1986 running around with a German flag in Mexico City? It's not happening. But in Brazil, it made sense. So it's an extraordinary cosmopolitan moment, and sets the seal on this golden image of Brazil as, you know, playing beautiful samba football. And of course this is, the relationship is complex, but you know, this is a great moment of Brazilian music as well outside of Brazil. It's the first time anyone's going, oh, samba, bossa nova, yeah, they actually make music in Brazil. So it all becomes tied together. That holds. I mean, that's the myth, you know, really sort of set almost in stone for the next 50 years. And the peak of that era is the 1970 World Cup. You may know that. Brazil win their 3rd title. They get to keep the old trophy. It is considered to be, in the Elliott-like canon of football games, the greatest game ever in the history of the World Cup, the greatest game ever. I mean, it's often portrayed as that. That's the folk memory of it, reproduced endlessly in the kind of journalistic discourse in Brazil and elsewhere. And they are good. No joke. They are really very good. Whether it is the greatest is another matter. Anyway, that's how it's remembered. They beat Italy 4-1. And one of the reasons that it's so celebrated is the first World Cup that's shown in colour. And I think that's a big part of it. And those yellow shirts in the kind of noonday sun in Mexico City, they are shimmering. I mean, they're not yellow, they're gold. And there's something about the sort of deep azure blue of the Italian shirts and the intensity of the green, particularly in sort of crappy old colour television, which used to really up these things. And I think, you know, I'd never watched colour television before that. That was pretty much I think I've watched one advert for Heinz tomato soup, but that's red. For the blue, yellow, gold, it's got to be the 1970 World Cup. So for all sorts of reasons, it has this extraordinary status, and again sets the seal on the idea of Brazil, national identity, beautiful, musical, racially unproblematic football. That's the sort of equation. And I actually, in retrospect, view it as a terrible tragedy. And the reason that I view it as a terrible tragedy is that the military are now in power. They've been in power for 6 years, and as you know, it was a long, brutal and completely fruitless dictatorship for nearly 20 years, just over 20 years, I would say. And what you saw on the field was the last moment of the old era, the era of a democratic Brazil. It wasn't produced by the military. They were just damn lucky to be on watch and get that moment. I mean, indeed, the Brazilian military hated football originally. When they came to power, their only policy on football was to get footballers to pay their back taxes. Otherwise, they didn't give them monkeys. And the triumph, you know, happens, and instead of going to Rio, the cup is celebrated in Brasilia with the military cabinet. There's all the pictures of General Medici holding the cup and looking incredibly sinister. And the military at this point decide, right, football, we are going to remake it in our own image. And that's what they do for the next 15 years. And many of the pathological things about contemporary Brazilian football, the terrible corruption, the terrible levels of violence, the appallingly awful unstylish forms of play, the incredibly retrograde way in which players are treated, the enduringly sexist and racist cultures that still persist within it, are either created or deeply entrenched by this period of military intervention in football. And it takes many forms. The military, they take over the national team and they start installing their own guys in the team. And you've got people like Claudio Coutinho, who's in charge in '78, and he's saying stuff like, dribbling? I hate dribbling. Dribbling is expressive of everything that is weak and appalling about Brazilian football. And anyone who dribbles, anybody who's slightly to the left in politics, anyone who's just trouble, they're all out of the team. They're all out of the team, and consequently Brazil 1978 are just awful, only slightly less awful than Brazil 74. And then you get the dude at 1990 who's a man so obsessed with the sweeper system, which is a super defensive way of playing soccer if you're not familiar with that. He actually writes a PhD on the sweeper system, and then they make him the Brazilian coach. And this dude describes the team in military metaphors, you know, the defence of the light artillery, you've got the cavalry on the wing, it's all kind of, and they all get incredibly muscular. I think there was probably a lot of substance abuse as well. And you get these really ugly teams, apart from 82, 86, and you get a lot of really ugly, tough football within Brazil. People start contrasting, you know, football arte, you know, footballers art with football força, or, you know, football resultados. You know, those become the way. And Phil Scolari, right, who was the coach, right, of the Brazilian team. This is a man who cut his teeth in the Brazilian league in the early 1990s, encouraging and training his own ball boys to distract opposition goalkeepers and pioneering the model of the 60 foul game, with which he won 2 championships with Grêmio, but man, it was ugly. So 70 is a tragedy, and then there's a long era, you know, through the military era, and then all the terrible years of hyperinflation. And those of you know your Brazilian history, like the late 80s and the early 90s were really mean. IMF readjustments, terrible levels of inequality, the explosion of street violence, the securitization of Brazilian cities. I mean, it really falls apart. And of course they don't win the World Cup. 24 years without. And 1994 is such an interesting moment, and again my moment here is to talk about the final. And you know, this is really when the Brazilian myth began to die, but people refuse to believe it because everyone really wants to hang on to the myth. But Carlos Alberto Pereira, who was number 2 to who was the number 2 in the Brazilian setup this time, is the coach. And he says in an interview with the New York Times beforehand, he says, magic and dreams are dead in football. I mean, you're going into the World Cup as Brazil's coach and you're saying magic and dreams are dead. And they were. That team did not play with magic. They had Romario, who had a kind of, you know, underworld Brazilian kind of, you know, Artful Dodger character to him. But it was absolutely the most boring, awful Brazilian team. You know, they were competent, they defended well, but there's no magic in that team. And how did they win? You know, how did they win the final? They won it in a penalty shootout after 120 excruciating minutes, you know, and then they only win it because the poor Italian dude, Baggio, sticks the ball over the post. So what's interesting about that is that while people celebrated, it never quite had the intensity of 58 and 70, which really did, you know, you go back into the kind of oral history record, these were truly transformative moments for your average Brazilian, really absorbed into personal and collective understanding of the Brazilian nation and Brazilian kind of collective memory. And 94, like, what kind of national myth you're going to build out of an Italian missing a penalty? It's not the stuff out of which this can be cast. So what I sense in 94 is that the hold over the collective imagination and the place of football in Brazilian national identity is weakening. It's weakening because people have got cynical. It's weakening because the football actually isn't what it's meant to be. And indeed, a close look at the way football is run tells you, instead of everything that's good about Brazil, it tells you so much about, you know, what's been going wrong. And that's exemplified by my penultimate game, which is the 2002 World Cup final, where they come back and win it for the 5th time. And what's interesting about that moment, and which connects us to the 7-1, is that in 2001, the greatest investigation ever conducted into Brazilian football by the Congress, 2 congressional committees, reported prior to that World Cup. And they were triggered really by the CBF-Nike relationship. After, you maybe remember the 98 World Cup, Ronaldo, the star, turns up in the final against France, and it's like the this is not a man who should be on the pitch. He's clearly not well. He wanders around for 90 minutes going, where am I? And anyway, there was a big scandal, and eventually it turns into a serious investigation into Brazilian football. And it's worth reading, actually. For those of you, me and Google Translate spent a lot of time. They're hidden away on the Ministry of Sport's website, but they are there. And to cut a long story short, they said Brazilian football is a den of iniquity, corruption, incompetence, embezzlement, cheating and malpractice of every single imaginable kind, not as a one-off, but systematically at every level. It called for 55 of the leading figures in Brazilian football, from the top of the CBF to the presidents of federations and football clubs, not merely to be investigated, but to be immediately charged, immediately criminally charged. And, you know, I'm no forensic expert, but the evidence looked pretty unambiguous to me. I mean, it was just, some of it is comic, what is going on. And how many of those criminal investigations were begun? Not a single one. Not a single one. Why? Well, partly Brazil's Byzantine, you know, legal system. I mean, you know, Brazilian football politicians are hardly the only people in the country getting away with that. But Brazil wins the 2002 World Cup, and it's Ruben Mafaz, as they say, excuse my Portuguese, you know, but, you know, he steals, but he makes things happen. And that has become, you know, the catchphrase, I mean, the common sense of so much of Brazilian life. And that was applied completely to the football world. It's like, you won the World Cup, slate clean, guys. And the problem, of course, as we know, you know, when you wipe the slate clean, actually it doesn't disappear. And it festers and it festers and it festers and it becomes institutionalised. And thus it is that you arrive in 2014 and you say, why is that Brazilian team actually so bad? That was not good. I mean, the fact they made it to the semi-finals is a miracle, you know. I mean, the refereeing help that they had to have, the fact that they were allowed to get away with 63 fouls against Colombia and still have 11 players on the pitch. I mean, I was rolling around on the floor when I wasn't screaming about it. They were absolutely appalling. They were without character, calibre, style, wit or organisation. Clearly, I mean, the quality of touch in that team, when you compared them to the Germans, it was like, really? Who loves the ball here? You know, which is always the claim of Brazilians, is that only we understand the ball, only we really love the ball. I thought Manuel Neuer, who's the goalkeeper of the German side, had better touch than most of the Brazilian team. And that is where Brazilian football, it has been a tragedy in the last 10 years, what has happened to Brazilian football, in the sense of the complete loss of players. You know, the export-led economy of the last 10 years, there are 1,500 Brazilian professionals playing overseas. So, you know, you've got the young, the old and the mad basically are left behind. The level of stealing, of incompetence has been through the roof. And the level of violence in Brazilian football, both on the pitch and most tragically off the pitch, is simply extraordinary. I mean, you all know, you know the couplet of English football hooligans, all right? It is nothing compared to what has happened in Brazil. I mean, according to Brazilian researchers, 250 people have been killed at Brazilian football in the last 20 years. Fans, either inside or outside the state. 250 people. Imagine if 250 people have been killed at basketball games in this country in the last 20 years. Someone would have something to say, wouldn't they? In Brazil, nothing. Life is cheap, you know? And the same goes for the way in which players are treated. So for me, that was what was expressed. I mean, it also expressed just how amazing the Germans are, you know? I mean, let's not take it. That's what modern football looks like. You know, to me, I mean, they look like a really good Champions League side. I think they'd have given Real Madrid. I think they'd have given anyone a run for their money, actually. I mean, telepathically networked, really brainy footballers, you know, who all communicate with each other. And, you know, David Luiz and his ridiculous singing. It's like, really? The amount that you sing the national anthem is going to tell us how good you're going to play? It was the most irresponsible and terrible kind of captaincy I've seen in a long time. But what, in the end, why did I enjoy it? It's not because I don't like Brazil or I want to be mean to the Brazilians. But what I didn't want to see was 2002. I didn't want to see they steal but they get things done again, because just too much of that. So for me, you know, the great victory, the great thing about Germany doing that is that it has not been possible, you know, for the Brazilian Football Federation to insulate themselves from the criticism that they so justly deserve, which would have been another generation lost, basically. If they'd have won that, it would have been lost. I mean, not that the level of scrutiny is, you know, is so high that they're about to be displaced, but at the very least they cannot crow any longer. And at the same time, I think it reflected a new sophistication amongst the Brazilian public. There was no outburst of insane regret. There was no scapegoating. There was no acid bath of racism. There was a much, much more adult, mature, yeah, you know, it was a great tournament though, we had a great party, and you know what, actually we were bloody awful, you know. I mean, there was a certain amount of scapegoating, particularly directed towards Gilmer, but that's a whole nother side. So I think in that regard, 7-1, you know, which seemed such a kind of national tragedy, actually viewed a little later is less of a tragedy than it seems. It's about a Brazil that's grown up quite a lot. It's a Brazil that is more sophisticated and more mature, and thankfully a Brazil in which, you know, the most appalling and corrupt bit of the Brazilian elite are not allowed to read themselves in glory as that they have done in the past. And that's my sense of 7-1.